What I'll be providing today is a very brief snapshot of what's in the literature regarding risk factors for young onset colorectal cancer. And as an epidemiologist, what sort of keeps us going are things like this. We see rises in different diseases. We want to understand what the distribution of disease, the patterns of disease, the frequencies of disease. So when we see a report like this and what's been presented throughout the conference, which was recently published at the end of last year, the projected increase in rectal and colon cancer in those 20 to 34 years of age is upwards of 30 to 90%. So this is something that sort of keeps us going to try and understand the who, the what, the where, the when. And so one of the ways we begin investigating this type of issue is to start with what we know. And what we know about colorectal cancer in adults is that there's a number of established risk factors. So there's many factors that increase risk, including hereditary factors and medical history, and a number of behavioral risk factors. There's also a number of factors that decrease risk, and a lot of these are related to lifestyle, everything from physical activity to dairy consumption, fiber, and especially aspirin use, which has about a 50% reduced odds or is associated with a 50% reduced odds of colorectal cancer. So the other thing we know is that the growth of a colorectal tumor is very slow going, and it takes several decades, in the adult population anyway. And we do know that the adenoma is a prime point of prevention, and this is a really very nice target for prevention because it is the precursor to colorectal cancer. About 96% of sporadic colorectal cancers arise from the adenomatous polyp. So that is why for people over 50, screening is such a significant factor in reducing risk. There are also a number of genetic alterations that progress from the ACF, which is the aberrant crypt foci, or the normal epithelium, which is the step before that, all the way to colorectal carcinoma. Some of these drivers are inflammatory in nature and COX-2 overexpression, as well as some other changes in KRAS and APC. So when we think about risk factors for early onset colorectal cancer, first thing that comes to mind is, are they environmental? Are the risk factors behavioral? But and do we really think about what is the timing of the exposure? Does it have to happen at birth? Is it prenatal? Is it in early childhood, adolescence, before puberty? We don't know. And then where is the optimal place to intervene at what time point? And then are the risk factors modifiable? And are the same determinants for over 50 colorectal cancer the same in the under 50? So these are the issues that I was setting out to study in what I'm going to present today. So I've conducted a large literature review, and my main aim was to characterize the modifiable risk factors for colorectal cancer, the things that are within our control, and then summarize the potential biological links for early age onset colorectal neoplasia. And then the whole goal of the whole study was really to look at all of the clinically significant factors, including lifestyle, behavioral, and some of the clinical presentation. But what I'm going to focus on today are the modifiable risk factors, and very briefly, some of what we think might be the links, but none of this is really established to any point in this young group. The whole goal of this project and the future goal down the road is to identify groups who are suitable for early screening and detection. How can we figure out what risk factors people have, and how can we get them into screening sooner? So the literature review that I conducted includes about 141 articles, and the earliest article was published in 1939. It was a retrospective chart review by Bacon et al. And since then, there's been a number of studies conducted, obviously, and the majority of these have been single institution studies, and just until recently, there's been a lot more population-based studies published. And so we're really starting to see this increase in the literature. Just in the past 5 years, 40% of the articles of young onset colorectal cancer have been published. So there's been a real rise in this as an emerging area of study. So as an epidemiologist and looking at the literature, we sort of classified, I'm going to go through study designs a little bit, so I want to give you a very brief background here. There's two kind of big categories. We look at descriptive studies, which sort of generate hypothesis, which is sort of how some of this research and this question started. Some people were anecdotally and publishing on descriptive studies to say, look what's happening to this young group, here's the rise in incidence. And where I'm really focused on now is looking at what analysis has been done. And there's two sort of big categories of analytic studies. There's experimental, which people may be familiar with, randomized clinical trials, which are the gold standard. People get a treatment, they get a placebo. And then there's observational studies, which really just follows people in their natural environment. You don't intervene and you don't provide an agent, you just take people and you follow them forward. Or you can look backwards as well. So in looking at what's available in the literature out of these 141 studies, what I found for risk factor related studies were 18 observational studies. There's no randomized clinical trials. 8 of those were cohort studies and 10 were case control. Cohort studies is when you start with an exposure and follow people out to see if they develop disease. Case control studies, you start with the disease and you look backward to see what the exposure was. Among these studies, there are different risk factors that have been studied, obesity, diabetes, occupational exposures, and physical activity. And when I looked specifically, I started with obesity, and we actually did a separate study on this to actually look at the rates of colorectal cancer in the under 50 group in New York State, and then looked at the rise in obesity in New York State. So of these 141 articles, we pulled out a subset of this to see how many were related to obesity. And there were 12 studies related to obesity and early onset colorectal cancer. 7 of these were cohort studies, so these are studies where people were followed forward. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to give the snapshot of what's been found. And all 7 cohort studies that were analyzing data for those under 50 associated with obesity were all positive, meaning there was a positive association between increasing adiposity in early adulthood and early colorectal cancer under 50. Now, if you notice carefully under the age column, you'll see that each of these cohort studies includes a range of participants. These aren't all under 50. And this is one of the limitations of looking at cohort studies because we're looking at people following them forward, it would take forever to follow someone today and see if they eventually got colorectal cancer. So we're sort of stuck by these established cohorts to look at what age groups were studied. And unfortunately, a lot of these large cohorts started at 40s and 50s, so we get a very small population. So we just have to keep that in mind in looking at the results. On the other hand, like I mentioned, case control studies start with the disease. So it's a really good study design for rare cancers and rare diseases like young onset. So if you see on the age category here, they're all under 50 because they very intentionally chose the group who had colorectal cancer under 50 and then looked back and looked at their body weight through records that they were able to capture through medical records, recall, and all of these studies were positive except for one. There was a negative association between obesity in childhood and colorectal cancer under 50. And this makes sense because there is a tremendous amount of literature linking obesity with colorectal cancer. And the most important thing to consider here, and something that requires a lot of further evaluation, is not just looking at body mass index, which all of these studies looked at body mass index, but you need to really look at body composition because the relationship between fat mass and muscle mass produces a much different result. And we know in adult cancer survivors, people who have a higher percentage of lean body mass, it serves as protection for survival and prognosis. We don't really know as much in primary prevention, but this is an area of great need to study. There's a lot of limitations with BMI. If anyone's interested, we can discuss it. And also visceral adiposity. So again, it's not going to capture BMI. Really, waist circumference is sometimes a proxy for visceral adiposity. And visceral adiposity is different than subcutaneous adiposity. So you might have an obese person that has very little subcutaneous fat, but they have a lot of fat around their organs. And this is a very highly metabolic type of fat that produces all kinds of inflammatory cytokines that is very deleterious to not only colorectal cancer, but a number of other diseases leading to insulin resistance, diabetes, etc. So really, you have to break down obesity more specifically than what has been done. So the other risk factors that were in the literature were focused on diabetes, physical activity, dietary factors, and occupational exposures. Among all these other risk factors, there was really only one cohort study that was able to assess some of these risk factors in a large population. So this study was published in 2012, and the goal was to examine age and sex-specific risks of colorectal cancer in a diabetic population. So this was conducted in Taiwan. They looked at a number of claim records, and the main outcomes of the study were the fact that these patients were followed from 2000 to 2006, and the overall significantly high risk of developing a malignant colon neoplasm was 1.3, meaning they had a 30% increased risk in men and a 21% increased risk in women. However, as you note here, again, it's a cohort study. The age is 45 years and over. So basically, they didn't find anything in those between 45 and 50. There was no significant relationship associated with diabetes and colorectal cancer in that group. But they did find a significant association between the 45 to 65-year-old age group. And this may imply a positive relationship between the duration of diabetes and the risk of colorectal cancer. However, this needs further investigation. And the cohort studies that we have available right now are very difficult to assess this in. There were 5 case control studies. So these are studies, again, they started with those who have colorectal cancer. And as you can see, for all these studies, the age was under 50. And there was a number of risk factors studied in these case control studies. I'm going to go through each one very briefly. The first one, these were 3 Italian and a Swiss case control study that were pooled together. And the study objective here was to look at early onset colorectal cancer and look at estimates for specific risk factors. So here are some of the risk factors that they looked at. The only 2 that were modifiable were those having to do with alcohol and those having to do with processed meat consumption. And in this study, they found significant relationships, in fact, a 56% increased risk among those who had more than 14 drinks per week of alcohol, and those who were in the highest tertile of processed meat. I'm sure no one's drinking that much alcohol here. So there's about 56% increased risk in both of those modifiable factors. The factors that decrease risk were mainly related to dietary factors and nutrients. So you see that as you go down the list there, from the vegetables to the fruits, fish intake, and then beta-carotene, vitamin C, vitamin E, folate. They weren't taking supplements. Please don't misinterpret this as these were supplements. They actually extracted that information from the food frequency questionnaire to find the actual amounts of these different nutrients. So for vegetables, you see about a 60% reduced risk. Citrus fruits, about a 40% decreased risk. They didn't find a significant association for fruits overall. It was really citrus fruit, which has a specific polyphenol called limonene, which may be one of the associated factors with lower risk. And then with fish intake and then some of the vitamins, you see you're getting about a 40 to 30 to 40% reduced risk with some of these dietary factors. There weren't any significant associations with physical activity, overweight, diabetes in this group. The second study, they looked at school milk consumption in the cases that they enrolled. This was in New Zealand. Their cases were participated in school milk programs, and they wanted to see if there was a significant association with early onset colorectal cancer. And there was no significant association in this younger group, 30 to 49 years of age. And so even though it was associated with a reduction overall, it was not in this particular age group. The third study, this one I'm not going to focus too much on because they really looked at a number of factors that were modifiable, such as hormone use, diabetes, aspirin, NSAID use, multivitamin use, alcohol, physical activity, and tobacco. However, the results actually only found significant associations for things that are pretty much non-modifiable. And they had very low recruitment rates to this study, so it's very hard to take this forward to a more definitive study. The fourth study is another study that was conducted, this one in Italy, again looking at diabetes. This is the case control study. Don't forget, where we're starting with the age. They started with people under 75, so you did get some people over 50 in this group. And the significantly elevated relative risk for colorectal cancer among diabetes were reported for cancers of the liver, pancreas, and endometrium, but there was no link between diabetes and colorectal cancer in the younger age group. The last study of the other risk factors, this study by Peters et al. Was looking again at this younger group, 25 to 44, with the majority between 35 and 44, and the goal was to evaluate risk factors related to the rectum and 3 subdivisions of the colon. And in this study, they found that physical activity, a number of dietary factors, and then some occupational factors having to do with dust, fumes, and the strongest associations were for wood and metal dust. So when we think about possible links, I'm just going to switch gears now to sort of that second aim of the literature review, and this is still very preliminary. But the potential links to early onset colorectal cancer with these risk factors sort of makes sense, and some of what we've heard about today, that the early postnatal period is a period of a very high physiologic change. There's a lot of transformation occurring. There's a lot of opportunity for there to be mutations and for alterations in DNA. So there is a direct evidence that epigenetic regulatory mechanisms in the gastrointestinal tract continue to develop in the postnatal period. So we know that these very early exposure, and that's where I get back to timing, is where do you really need to be exposed to these risk factors to see an effect? So far, some of the hypothesized mechanisms, and a lot of these are for patients over 50 or people over 50, are such that they're mediated through adiposity in a lot of cases. So dietary factors such as the Western diet pattern that's really high in fast food and red meat consumption, refined carbohydrates, high sedentary behavior, which the latest reports are that the majority of Americans spend about 8 or 9 hours sitting per day. And physical activity and physical inactivity, which is distinctly different than sedentary behavior. If you're physically inactive, it doesn't mean you're sedentary. There's a lot of physically inactive people that sort of mill around and doing things all day, and they're not sedentary. But sedentary behavior, people that sit the most, is associated with not only increased adiposity, but all of these other mechanisms, including metabolic dysregulation, insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, hyperlipidemia. Inflammation is a big one that mediates this response. Vitamin D, and then I sort of added this in terms of gut microbiome. We don't know enough about what's going on with that, especially in the young population. So when we think about from birth to the time that someone might develop colorectal cancer, there's a number of places for prevention. In this initial period between birth and a person that develops a polyp or their first colorectal cancer or some dysplastic lesion, there's a number of foods that serve as chemopreventive agents that have very high concentrations of constituents that can prevent this early stage of initiation. And then there's other things in our diet, and even some forms of physical activity can have effects on reducing inflammation, on reducing apoptosis, angiogenesis, these factors that are associated with promoting a polyp or a pre-neoplastic lesion to colorectal cancer. So really, we have to think about the life course, we have to think about the timeline, we have to figure out when it's most optimal to intervene, especially in this young group. So I just want to touch on this just to finish what I'm going to speak about today. And this is the precursor to colorectal cancer. And as I mentioned, the adenoma is the prime point of prevention. About 30 to 40% of the population will develop an adenoma by the time they're 60. In this young group, there's a few studies that have been published to show, and there's some evidence that there's the prevalence of polyps and adenomas are similar in patients 40 to 49 as they are in patients 50 to 59. So I know we're talking a lot about colorectal cancer, but we really need to back up and say, can we talk about the adenoma? Can we talk about colorectal neoplasia, which isn't full-blown cancer yet, but it's a tremendous opportunity for chemoprevention and for reversing. You can't reverse it, but you can slow the growth and you can actually prevent those pre-neoplastic changes from going further. And so 20 to 50% of adenomas will recur in 3 to 5 years after you've had one removed. Depends on a number of things. Everything from the size of the polyp or adenoma, the number, the location, where it was located in the colon, was it distal or proximal, and what some of the features were. So I just want to touch on 2 very quick things. There was a cross-sectional study recently published last year, And they looked at risk factors in people 30 to 39 and 40 to 49 and compared those to people over 50. And this was conducted in Korea. And they found a number of factors related with the 30 to 39-year-old group. Male sex is one of the key risk factors, which you see that throughout the literature. Males are at higher risk. Smoking, fatty liver, metabolic syndrome, obesity, elevated fasting blood glucose, elevated triglycerides, these were all associated with increased risk of neoplasia. And the smoking was sort of a unique finding here, and this corroborates other studies that have been conducted with smoking, knowing that current smokers from this previous study were twice as likely to develop colorectal adenomas versus non-smokers. And there's some speculation that smoking has a greater effect in the younger group than it does in the older population, and this all still has to be investigated. And this is a study that we're about to contribute to the literature that we're going to publish here soon. We're looking at colorectal adenoma recurrence in people between 40 and 50 that enrolled in the study with a colorectal polyp. And this study, the aim was just to look at demographic and lifestyle factors related to under 50 versus over 50. So there was a total population of 1,730 people, and I got this data by pooling 2 large phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials together to get this population. And all of these people that contributed to this data set had to complete a food frequency questionnaire and an activity questionnaire. And so I just have 2 quick findings. One is in our preliminary results, we found that there's statistically significant differences between those under 50 versus over 50. And this is really key. In the under 50 group, in people who are under 50, they're less likely to have previous polyps, which makes sense. They don't have as much time to get a polyp as someone over 50. They're not using as much aspirin. They're not as sedentary. Their consumption of total dietary fat is lower. And then some of the other fatty acids and calcium, you'd expect calcium to be lower as well. They're not taking supplements. But in the younger group, they're also more likely to consume saturated fat. They're more likely to be current smokers. They're more likely to consume red meat. And they're more likely to have a higher pro-inflammatory diet. And we measured that by using the Dietary Inflammatory Index, which is an index that measures the inflammatory potential of someone's diet. So the higher the index is, the more pro-inflammatory, meaning more fried food, more things that are going to increase sort of systemic inflammation, and the lower is anti-inflammatory. And so we found 2 main significant findings in this younger group. For previous polyps, if you are younger than 50 and you've had a previous polyp, your risk of recurrence is about 5-fold. If you're over 50, your risk of recurrence is about 40%. If you're a current smoker and you're under 50, your risk, your odds of smoking, for those who had a polyp recur under 50, their odds of recurrence was 5-fold as well. So they have you can see even when you look at the over 50 group, there's a much different relationship between smoking and adenoma recurrence if you're under 50 than if you're over 50. Your risk goes way up. So we think there might be some biological difference with smoking and how it reacts with the neoplastic changes. So there are a number of implications. Previous polyps appears to be a stronger risk factor for recurrence if you have one, even though they're lower in frequency. If you get one, you really should take action with some of these things that can lower your risk for neoplasia. There's a number of unidentified risk factors that we may not have identified. And then, of course, efforts to further identify risk factors is needed. So just quickly, sort of to summarize the risk factors that we found so far in the literature. There's a suggested link between obesity, but we definitely need other trials to verify that. The evidence of an association with diabetes is unclear based upon what's been published. There's numerous dietary factors which are protective. Dairy is still inconclusive. Occupational exposures, and that study was published, I think, in 1989, so we probably need to update what occupational exposures we're looking at. Metabolic syndrome, obesity, metabolic dysregulation, and smoking, definite association with colorectal neoplasia. And then there's a suggestion of more deleterious lifestyle factors among people under 50 who have colorectal adenoma recurrence. And so finally, our next steps, where I'm really hoping to continue my work with Dr. Weber and others, is to further look at the etiology of young onset colorectal cancer by studying other study designs. Maybe we can do a randomized clinical trial one day. Identify biomarkers and explore potential mechanisms of action. We still don't understand fully the biological link because there might be differences in the tumor types and the risk factors in the younger group. And then explore the idea of adding some of these environmental and behavioral factors to risk assessment tools. Can we add in metabolic syndrome? Can we add in some other things that we think are particularly making the development of this disease higher in the under 50 population? So if anyone has any questions, please let me know, and thank you.